Hello and welcome to Politics Today. I'm Farrukh Pitafi. Today we are going to talk about Afghanistan, especially the future of peace process in Afghanistan, which seems to be at a stalemate right now. There are three important developments. Number one, Prime Minister of Pakistan once again spoke on record on the floor of the House about the Pakistan's role in stabilizing Afghanistan and the region. He said that Pakistan is going to be a partner in peace, but Pakistan will not repeat the mistakes of the past and hence never an ally in war. That is interesting because he then also qualified that argument with the examples from the what he believes are the mistakes in past 20 years, siding with the US, the bases and all. Then the second aspect is that tomorrow parliamentarians, a select group of parliamentarians in the National Security Committee of the National Assembly, headed by the Speaker National Assembly, is going to be briefed by the country's military Him. Particularly, we hear that DGI is going to actually brief them on the Afghan situation and other regional issues. And that is not all. When you look at the list of names on that committee, it is veritable who's who of the parliament: Bilawal Bhutto Zardari, Shehbaz Sharif, umpteen other leaders from various parties, and then 16 other have been invited to actually participate as well. And then today there was an unfortunate incident that took place when miscreants from across the Afghan border actually fired at Pakistani forces, and two office bearers actually embraced martyrdom. We are going to talk about all these matters, but before we move forward, let me read these three important cards that we have prepared for you. They are basically actually quotes from Pakistan's leaders. Prime Minister of Pakistan. Okay, so first of all, it starts with ISPR. Terrorists from inside Afghanistan across the international border attack military post in Dabatoi, North Waziristan, ISPR. And then, of course, as I pointed out, there are two casualties as well. Pakistan, okay. I oppose Pakistan's participation in US war on terror. Pakistan will never compromise its sovereignty under any circumstances. Pakistan paid a heavy price in war against terrorism. Prime Minister Imran Khan. Right. So these are the quotes that we had to actually show you. I am not sure whether we have a package today or not. Okay, we have a package. First watch that, then I'm going to introduce the guest in the studio. Let us watch that report that our team has prepared for you.
The all Afghan dialogue has failed, and Taliban are swiftly conquering district after district, while the ANA is dropping arms and retreating, and some are even joining Taliban ranks. The power vacuum left behind by the crumbling Afghan government and the warring factions will make civil war inevitable. On July 1st, an in camera briefing will be conducted by military officials for the Parliamentary Committee on National Security, with Afghanistan as its main agenda. The fallout of impending civil war in Afghanistan will be devastating for Pakistan. Therefore, a thorough strategy must be made with all stakeholders on board. Pakistan has paid for peace with both blood and sweat for the past 40 years, and any more bloodshed will derail the stability brought about by our previous sacrifices. Pakistan has consistently been asking Afghanistan to ensure effective border control on their side. There have been many cross-border attacks every year, and the sons of the soil pay the price for it. The 14-point terms of engagement approved by Parliament in April 2012 also barred the government from allowing the US to conduct any operations from Pakistani soil, as well as entering into any verbal agreement. Unanimously adopting the work plan for 2021, the Committee on Defense and National Security underlined that it will work closely with the Ministry of Defense to ensure the implementation of the 14-point work plan. As PM Imran Khan asked, if the US could not defeat the Taliban with bases and troops inside Afghanistan, how could they possibly achieve that objective from bases in Pakistan?
So, as I pointed out, situation seems precarious in Afghanistan. We are going to talk about that. Let me introduce the guests we have got in the studio. We have with us Ambassador Asif Durrani Saab, needs no introduction, quite regular on this show, on this channel, and a prolific writer and expert on international affairs, career diplomat. Thank you very much, sir,
Thank you
for being part of the program. Air Vice Marshal retired Faiz Amir Saab joins us also in the studio. He is a senior analyst, an expert on defense and security affairs, also a pedagogue, has been heading universities and has been attached to academic institutions. Thank you very much, sir, for being part of the program. Syed Muhammad Ali Saab, adjunct professor, Georgetown University, actually joins us on Skype. Dr. Saab, thank you very much for being part of the program as well. With your permission, Dr. Saab, let me start with the studio. Let me ask Ambassador Durrani Saab, sir, what is the state of affairs in Afghanistan? And why is it that we feel that we are facing the same dilemma we have been facing for 20 years?
Well, thank you, Farrukh. I think on the political front, there is a stalemate.
Yeah.
The idea that with the withdrawal schedule given by the Americans, there will be a dialogue process between the Taliban and Ashraf Ghani government. It got delayed unnecessarily for almost 6 months, ever since they signed the agreement in February last year.
All right.
And the pretext was release of 5,000 Afghan Taliban, which Ashraf Ghani government in fact dilly-dallied, and they had the pretext that we did not sign the agreement with the Taliban, it was with the Americans. So in a way they were telling that the Americans that they are not responsible. And secondly, I think they were expressing their annoyance to the Americans because in the whole dialogue process, Americans sidelined Ashraf Ghani.
All right.
Secondly, when you talk about on the military front, then Afghan national security forces, those are, while Americans have trained them, still their own American commentators say that there's much to be desired as far as their training is concerned, the standard of their training is concerned, and the motivation is concerned. On the Taliban side, you find motivated people. They, in fact, they can even go for the suicide attacks, which the Afghan army side would not do. And more importantly, there's corruption in the Afghan National Defense forces.
Right.
And the result is that there's the highest number of desertion in the Afghan army. Then there are ghost soldiers, which in fact line up the pockets of their higher-ups in the forces.
Right.
And then these forces are also involved in narcotics trade, which is also in fact benefiting, which is giving benefit to who's who of Afghanistan.
Right.
So in that situation, when there is lack of governance, bad governance, inefficiencies, incompetences, you expect that they will deliver. I think that would be a tall order.
Right. Now, let me ask ABM Saab, you can add to what was said earlier. But the question is, I understand what is happening in Afghanistan. It seems to be a meltdown of sorts. But with due respect, why is it that A, either nobody saw it coming, or B, nobody actually prepared for it? Because it seems that we are going to have a regression to the pre-9/11 situation.
President Trump announced withdrawal in an election year. And most people thought that it's election year promises, one of those promises, that he might reconsider after he is elected. So the entire the allies of US, in West, in Europe and other places, and in Afghanistan, they always thought that there may be a need, there may be a reconsideration of the decision afterwards. President Biden wins the election, and in his election campaign, he had showed that he would keep certain forces in Afghanistan. But then his decision to pull back and just giving an allowance of 4 months to the Afghan government to prepare itself and the US forces to prepare themselves to leave, actually left everybody in a disbelief.
Right.
The Ashraf Ghani government never believed that the Americans would leave them in such a state. Now, a question arises, if the Americans were to leave Afghanistan in such a disarray, then why didn't they leave in 2002 after Tora Bora?
Right.
Why didn't they leave after 2011 after Osama bin Laden was killed?
Right.
Why didn't they leave after 2014 when President Obama had promised that he will pull out all the forces
Right.
by the end of the year? So the question is, why have they stayed on? Actually, the answer goes back to their unexpected victory in dislodging the Taliban in the first 60 days.
Right.
And then they had no idea what to do. And that perplexity has prevailed over the next 20 years. They got stuck down. They never knew when they should leave. Now the position is that the Afghan government finds itself unable to, and there are predictions by the Americans
Right.
that the government will collapse within 6 months after the withdrawal of the US forces. The question is, now what the Afghan government has resorted to, that they have made agreements, or they have incited, or they have talked to the warlords to resist Taliban. So what you're seeing is a civil war where obviously the NDS is not able to defend the entire rural Afghanistan. So the
Right.
rural Afghanistan is under the warlords, has
Right.
always been under the warlords. So the warlords will resist the Taliban because of their own
Right.
considerations. Now, I still believe that there will be battles for fortresses, like a fortress in Kabul, the fortress around the international airport, the fortress other major
Right.
district headquarters. So the battles are going to take place, but the disarray you find, it has been persisting for the last 20 years.
Right, but again, the problem is 20 years stay in a country and still no clue how to handle the
They
post-withdrawal
didn't
situation.
understand the culture of Afghanistan when they invaded Afghanistan.
Right, and we are going to talk about that as well. Let me bring in the third guest, Mohammed Ali Saab. Thank you very much once again for joining us. My question is about state of affairs in Afghanistan. If the biggest backer after the US government, India is thought to be one of the biggest backers of the Afghan government, if they have started negotiating with Afghan Taliban, do you see any hope for constitutionalism and existing political apparatus in Afghanistan in coming days?
Well, India has, it's true, I mean, when it comes to the region, I mean, given India's, I mean, for the size of its economy, it's not all that much, but I mean, India is not known for being an international donor. And it has, really invested. It's not like China being ambitious globally and asserting itself. And so comparatively, India has invested a serious amount of money into Afghanistan, I mean, from irrigational projects to other development work. And it's been interesting to see India create economic leverage for itself, something that Pakistan has been unable to do, even though there were opportunities, and those opportunities didn't come to fruition. I mean, this idea of the Reconstruction Opportunity Zone, which the US had suggested that there'd be preferential access to US markets for goods made jointly by Afghanistan and Pakistan, didn't really happen. There's still talk of that. But, I mean, on trade, although strategically Pakistan is very well placed, but there's been a lot of sputtering on trade opportunities. Now there's talk again of border markets with Iran and Afghanistan. Nonetheless, India had been investing in the economy. The US was somewhat sensitive to Pakistani concerns. I mean, sometimes, President Trump blurted out that, India needs to play a more proactive role, and Pakistan got, concerned. And then he said that he's talking not about a security role, but an economic role. So that, this has been a lingering concern, and perhaps, in Pakistan, that there was a certain amount of glee as well, that despite those investments and despite the insidious role played by India with sort of the BLA and sort of tapping into that disgruntlement and targeting CPEC Chinese projects. Excuse me.
Right.
That there's
And
been this kind of negative role that Pakistan has not been able to avert and not been able to match, and yet India did not get a seat at the table when it came to the negotiations.
Professor Sir,
And I think
we can
realizing
talk about
that and
India's
India's
role
negative
in coming.
stance vis-a-vis the Taliban, I think they've realized now they're reading the
Mohammed Ali sir,
atmosphere
can you
and
hear me,
trying to
sir?
hedge their bets. So,
Right. We
India
can
has
talk
started.
about India's role in next few minutes as well. But the question was essentially about the future of Afghan government. Do you see any possibility when one by one all the backers of Kabul government are actually talking to the Taliban? Is there a possibility that in coming days we see a replay of Najibullah episode, how that government was actually limited to Kabul and how the Taliban then took it out?
I mean, that is anyone's guess, right? I mean, that's what the U.S. says, that we don't want what happened to Najibullah for history to be repeated that way. And that's why they're talking about like counterterrorism operations and continuing to invest in the Afghan army, even if they are not quite ensuring a responsible exit after this 20-year legacy. But but that is, I mean, that's the kind, because if that happens, right? I mean, and there's also fractions, within. It's not like there's a unified, consolidated front against the Taliban. I mean, there's although there was an attempt to signal, going to Washington D.C., Abdullah and Ashraf Ghani going together, but there are frictions therein. So, and if there isn't a consolidated front and we see sort of the downfall of the government, I mean, that would be a signal of chaos escalating. And that would certainly not be a.
There is a possibility of
positive.
instability in Afghanistan. Then let us not talk about the implications for Pakistan. Ambassador sir, what are the implications for Pakistan? Asif Ali Zardari, former president, yesterday speaking before his participating in the National Assembly session, said that Afghan situation can have a ripple effect on Pakistan. It can seriously harm Pakistan. Now, what are the implications?
Well, the foremost being if there's chaos and civil war conditions in Afghanistan, so we should be prepared for the influx of refugees.
Okay.
That goes without saying, because for the Afghans, Pakistan is the most attractive destination because of the cultural reasons, and that has happened in the past as well. Whether not only after the coup of Nur Muhammad Tarake, but Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and then when Najibullah government fell, there was a fresh wave of refugees.
Right.
Even after Taliban, there was a fresh wave of refugees coming to Pakistan. So I mean, this is there. But here I would just pick up what Professor Ali Saab has said. You can't compare what happened during Najib's time. Even then, Afghanistan had a disciplined army. But unfortunately, my worry is that now it is not. This army is divided on factional basis, on the ethnic basis.
Right.
So much so that those non-Pashtun officers don't salute the Pashtun officers.
Okay.
And this has been the case. And then there's a new book which has come by Carter Malkazian on U.S. war in Afghanistan.
Right.
And I've just gone through the review by Christina Lamb in this month's Foreign Affairs.
Okay.
And that, in fact, gives the whole details, actually, even just going by through the review. The book has just hit the market.
Right.
So in that, they have now come around to the idea that what kind of blunders Americans and their allies have committed in Afghanistan.
Right.
The question is why they lost the war. This is the question which Malkazian has asked in his book.
Okay.
And this is what now you will have reams of books, reams of material coming out with regard to their failures. And that's why institutions were not built.
Right. We are going to see a lot of post-mortem, but the problem is America can afford to lose in Afghanistan because they don't live in the region. We live next to Afghanistan. You were talking about influx of refugees. Just to understand, given that we still have 3 million, somewhere around 3 million Afghan refugees in Pakistan at this moment, what was the maximum level of such an influx
It touched
historically?
close to 5 million
Okay,
at its peak when the Soviets were here.
right.
But then it came down after the 9/11. It came down.
Okay.
But we have almost 1.7 million registered refugees, and close to 1.3 million are unregistered
Right.
refugees.
So that also becomes quite a challenge for Pakistan. Let me ask you, AVM Saab, recently you must have seen the statements that if Taliban take over Kabul or if they actually take over Afghanistan and there is a possibility of influx of refugees, Pakistan may have to block its border, may have to close its border. How do you react to these statements? And what are other challenges Pakistan might face in case Taliban take over Kabul?
There are dire challenges that Pakistan faces. The first of all is the TTP itself.
Okay.
There are about there are estimated 5,000 TTP fighters in Afghanistan,
All right.
who what I would say is are available as mercenaries for any side to be employed by, because now they have lost their raison d'etre of their fighting against the Pakistan government, because the foreigners are leaving in any way. But now these 5,000 ragtag fighters are available to the Americans, to the Taliban, and to the Indians to put pressure on Pakistan.
Right.
And these,
but
and these
just for the sake of argument, nobody, neither the Kabul government nor the foreign elements in Afghanistan ever stopped TTP from conducting whatever they were doing.
Yes.
So how is that a worsening of a situation?
no, now is because now it is worsening because this is a time to put pressure on Pakistan. Because if Pakistan if it had agreed to give bases to the American forces, Taliban would have used them. Now, since Pakistan has refused to give them bases, so it is the other parties that probably would utilize these people. And let me suggest that in 2014-15, when the North Waziristan operation concluded, started, and then it concluded in 2015. The Taliban, the TTP elements in North Waziristan and South Waziristan, they just melted down within the public itself. Some of them crossed the border, others melted. So what I mean to say is that the Taliban across the border still have their links inside Pakistan in sleeper cells. So that is what can be utilized, and what is happening these days that you see on and off explosions and violence in Pakistan. The second biggest the challenge that of the Afghan refugees, Pakistan claims to have fenced its border almost
80%.
over 80%.
So
now
20% still remains.
So that would be the hard areas, and that probably would not be the routes that the refugees would use. So it means Pakistan is essentially talking of closing the crossing points from where the refugees could cross. The third major dilemma would be a diplomatic dilemma. Because everybody is sure that the steps towards that side are the collapse of the NDS, the National Defense Forces of Afghanistan, and then the collapse of Kabul, or fall of Kabul. Now, when fall of Kabul takes place, there would be a humanitarian disaster in Afghanistan.
Right.
Because the Americans are not going to fund or give any support to the new government if it is not a coalition government in Afghanistan.
Okay.
So that humanitarian crisis that will entail funding the new government, that will entail providing food, health, medicine to the entire population of Afghanistan, that would come, the onus will come on Pakistan.
Why?
Because Pakistan has the traditional links with Afghanistan, and we've always been supporting.
So does Iran,
No,
Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Russia,
Taliban
China.
would look would look for help in any direction. They would ask China, they would ask Pakistan, and Pakistan being the major route has major crossings with trade crossings with Afghanistan. So Pakistan would be bound to help the new government, whatever government it is, to overcome that humanitarian crisis. Now that is obviously that would need agreements at the government level, and that implies recognition of the new government in Kabul, and that will be a diplomatic conundrum for Pakistan.
Right.
That, would Pakistan be the first one to recognize the new government, or would there be other in the region who would, just to help the people of Afghanistan, would go in recognition?
As we move forward, we are going to address that question as well. What should be Pakistan's policy in that eventuality? But let me go back to Mohammad Ali Saab. Sir, you're listening to the discussion that is going on. Now the question right now is the state of agreement between the US and Taliban, because that is not a small agreement. I remember in those days, because everybody was concerned that the Taliban are not going to respect the fundamental human rights, the women's rights. So there was this implication that the US somehow actually convinced the Afghan Taliban to concede on certain points. But if now the withdrawal takes place the way it seems to be moving forward, Germany actually closed its operations today. So what becomes of that agreement and those rights that were agreed upon?
Well, Pitafi Saab, I think what the US is going to do and has already done, it was a very narrow, unambitious agenda, to get an exit. And the basic understanding was that the Taliban are not going to provide refuge to global jihadist outfits, particularly Al-Qaeda, which goes back to those 20 years earlier, where the way that it's positioned in the US is that once the US was attacked by Al-Qaeda, the Taliban didn't have, they were repressive and were doing terrible things within the country, but they were, their ambitions were confined to a power grab, brutal power grab within Afghanistan. But their refusal to hand over Al-Qaeda is what compelled then the US to come and seek revenge, right? And then in the process, of course, save Afghan women from Afghan, the brutality of the Taliban and whatever other reasons for the just war, right? Like open schools and undertake development and spend $2 trillion, of which we have, of course, just seen a very a modest sum go towards the development of Afghanistan, and the rest of it was spent on the military, right? Largely to keep the coalition forces and the US forces, fed and the logistics of the war machinery greased. So essentially, what they are doing now in order to ensure, and there wasn't much progress, right? Like the Taliban were not halting violence. On intra-Afghan peace talks were more of an afterthought, because the Afghan government was not quite happy with the US sort of directly negotiating with the Taliban. But once that was a done deal, and the bar was set very low that they are not going to allow the, they're going to try to not target coalition forces and not allow the Taliban to operate again and reach a level of organization that they can become an international threat again, when there wasn't adequate evidence of that, and there perhaps still isn't. And there's suspicion that the Taliban are also hedging their bets, because now if the Afghan National Army is going to remain propped up and it's going to remain well funded to resist an entire Taliban takeover, then the Taliban also need partners where they can get them. And maybe the Al-Qaeda will provide them at least this ideological support, and it might not have that much strength on the ground, but in terms of the optics of being a fear of, an enemy to be feared, they might have a more open relationship if it's going to come to an all right use of force, and they can't manage to grab power entirely. So they
Right.
are also hedging their bets, but for that, to address that concern, I think this is how we need to contextualize this whole idea of military bases, right? So the US, I think, realizing some of this, has been going to the neighborhood and asking for military bases and a military presence. And kudos to our government, at least on this front. I mean, because otherwise it also would have been political harakari, political suicide, after all that talk of collateral damage and drone strikes and complicity therein, if we had provided military
Right.
bases, right? So I mean, that
So
there's
that's
been
important.
so
But
far a
every
principled
answer that I'm
stance
getting
where
actually,
we
Dr. Saab
Pakistan doesn't
actually
want to, but
points to
wherever that
one
comes
thing,
from, that
and that
counterterrorism
is
capacity
that
is
in
going to try.
coming days, perhaps Pakistan is going to see a lot of refugee influx because human rights might be violated if Taliban take over without any agreement. So, what should be, Ambassador Saab, Pakistan's policy response? One is hardening the border, closing the border. The other must be some policy measures. What are those?
Well, we have to leave the Afghans to their own devices.
Okay.
Uh, uh, as the Prime Minister has also said it, that we don't have any favorites,
Okay.
and that should be the right approach. And so sooner or later, then everyone is going to realize that they have, they are not going to get the favor which they expected. And to this, I think now Indians have also realized that they have lost the game in Afghanistan.
Okay.
That's why now they are cultivating the Taliban in a way that we cannot have any leverage except that we have to give aid. And they have $2 to $3 billion worth of investment. That investment is mostly they spent on in building the parliament. That is their
Parliament, hospital,
flagship project.
and a dam also.
Hospitals, yeah. But overall, if you look at Pakistan's investment, that is close to $1 billion.
Yeah.
And if you compare Indian and Pakistani economies, then Pakistan has in fact given far more than what Indians have done it.
Okay.
But since there is the dispensation in Kabul has been hostile to Pakistan, so the Pakistan's good work, in fact, does not see the
Any
light of the day,
appreciation, yeah.
and it is not appreciated the
Yeah.
manner Indians are appreciated. And NDS, Afghan Intelligence Agency, and National Directorate of Security, actually is funded by the Indians.
Okay.
So now, whatever you see now, there is a flurry of activity taking place, whether in Balochistan or in North Waziristan, as well as along the border.
All right.
This is something, I think this is the last flicker they want to show,
Okay.
whatever they want to, and pressurize Pakistan. But I think it is not in Pakistan's hands. It is not in any of the Afghanistan's neighbors' hands to control the things inside Afghanistan.
All right.
Reason is that actual game is being played inside Afghanistan. Now, over 60 districts have fallen to the Taliban, and most of them without any resistance.
All right.
Now, what does that indicate? That indicates that people want peace. And what will happen, say, if we say that Taliban, they control Kabul by force, but what if the countryside and major cities fall without fighting?
Okay.
So what will be the shape of things which are going
Right.
to?
Right.
So
That's
in
an
that
important-
respect, I think we have to be mindful, and then I think everyone is watching that very carefully,
Right.
especially the immediate neighbors of Afghanistan. And herein lies the catch, that if all the neighbors of Afghanistan, major neighbors of, immediate neighbors of Afghanistan, if they decide that they will not allow the spoilers, they will not allow the mischief mongers and terrorists to operate through their borders, or they will not play the favorites, then I think this Afghan game can come to its logical conclusion rather much quicker than what we
But
anticipate.
it is a big if.
Well, there are many
historically
ifs.
never-
We are
yeah.
talking about Afghanistan.
Right.
Here, anything can happen.
Okay.
If those people, they can say defeat the empires, British or Soviets or the Americans,
Yeah.
then I think they have all the capability of spoiling their own broth.
Okay. Right. Here's the problem, ABM Saab. Of course, when it comes to policy decisions, one has to actually first of all, look at the country's own interest. And in that situation, of course, hardening of the border in that kind of an eventuality, if Afghanistan, God forbid, explodes, will be to harden the border. It might be the only possible solution. But on the other side, 40% of Afghan population is now under 18. People who were born after 9/11, after the US invasion and all that civilian transition, the kind of government. That and people who might be educated now, women, children, will face a lot of risk. And Pakistan keeps on talking about Afghanistan, Afghans being our brethren. So on one side, we have to actually care about our border, our country. On the other side is the humanitarian situation that might actually arise there. So how do you reconcile the two?
The first policy point I'll take from Prime Minister Imran Khan's today's speech, where he said that during the last 20 years war or 40 years war in Afghanistan, our border areas, former border areas have been destroyed, and they still have not been recovered. So I think our foremost policy point should be that we look after the people who got hurt, who got badly hurt during the last 20 years in our FATA areas, particularly Waziristan areas. Now, long time back I wrote that when the refugees from the IDPs from North Waziristan were still in the camps, I wrote that when these people go back, whether they wave Pakistani flag or they pick up the guns against Pakistani forces, depends how we treat them.
Okay.
I think we left them in a disarray for a very long time, in a neglect time. They were neglected for a very long time, and they still have some complaints the way they were settled back in their areas. I think to make sure that the Taliban, TTP from across, does not have any sympathizers on our side, in our border areas. We need to take care of our own people in North Waziristan, South Waziristan, and other areas. That is the first and foremost policy point.
It is point one.
Yeah.
Two.
What I want to again re-emphasize is it has been 3 years that FATA has merged with Pakistan since this government came. We haven't seen a report.
Merged with Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, it has been Pakistan's part.
In Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, we haven't seen a report on the progress on that merger, what kind of administrative setups have been set up in those areas, what are the facilities being provided to those areas. So there's a need to work in those areas and bring it out to the people that what has taken place in the last 3 years. Second, as I said, that the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan would be our crisis, and we'll have to support them. That's why I said that the
how support them?
Support them with material support, obviously.
So we close the border and yet provide relief?
Yes, we may not be able to afford more refugees on our side, because the people already here, they have been hard on our economy, and that is the largest size of refugees that any country has supported for such a long time, for 2 decades. So we may not be able to afford more refugees, and I would probably, and these are not only the refugees, they're the insurgents, they're the mischief makers who will come across along with these people, and they will create more problems for us in our side. So what I would say is that probably we should work out from now onwards plans how to help Afghanistan, those refugees that may leave their homes and go into camps within Afghanistan. We should be providing them support.
Yeah,
and
but bear in mind that at this moment, because you spoke about taking care of our own people, citizens in ex-FATA, Pakistan's economic condition isn't that great that Pakistan can become a donor. I'm told that we have to start concluding.
There are places, you see, there are donors in China, there would be people in Iran who would like to trust, people in Russia, there are people in Middle East who would like to support the humanitarian crisis, and Pakistan could be the conduit of all such support. Because we cannot leave the Afghan people in that crisis for the next many years. We have been with them in the last 20 years. So probably Pakistan will have to take care of them. The third point that Pakistan probably needs to do is to mobilize the regional countries. When
Right.
the Americans leave, they will lose their leverage on Afghanistan.
Right.
It's Pakistan, China, Iran, Russia. Probably they would have to work out to support
Right.
Afghan government.
I still have to go to Muhammad Ali Saab and then we have to conclude the program. Muhammad Ali Saab, one aspect which is important because we are talking about prospects of a humanitarian crisis. One statement, an odious statement came from the Afghan NSA, and that was primarily about Afghan muhajirin or refugees posing a threat to Pakistan or challenge to Pakistan if something bad happens in Afghanistan. Do you honestly think at this moment Afghan state of affairs is such that it can help itself rather than to think about anybody outside Afghanistan at all?
Well, I mean, it's a tenuous, it's a precarious situation at the moment. And I mean, of course, to help itself, I mean, two possibilities. I mean, one was the intra-Afghan peace talks, which haven't gone anywhere. I mean, there wasn't even after the Doha lackluster results. I mean, the idea of a Istanbul conference, that hasn't really happened. I mean, Turkey is like now a new player, which is going to try and continue. And, it said that it's going to provide security to the Kabul airport subsequently. But now, I mean, even if there was a national unity platform of some sort, and there's been discussions around it, but there's again been sort of political opportunism and sort of infighting, so there isn't a strong united front of the rest of Afghanistan that would have compelled the Taliban to back down. And the Taliban have been using force to create further leverage for themselves, because they know that at this juncture, the more force they use, the more muscle they have to dictate the future of Afghanistan. So in that context, I mean, it is a difficult situation. It's a difficult situation for neighboring countries. And looking back at it, I mean, there was a lot that could have been done. So agreed that, Pakistan, for the size of its economy, hasn't invested as much as India, but I mean, it has also made investments. I mean, it's been the host of one of the largest refugee populations, and therein lies the vulnerability. Right, we see it elsewhere also. I mean, the Syrian refugees in Germany, and one crazy guy does something on New Year's night, and then the entire refugee population, experiences the xenophobia. So, and similarly, Afghan refugees have also faced a tough time. In Pakistan, I mean, with limited resources, we did what we could. I mean, the UNHCR had a very large operation, but it wasn't a bed of roses for the Afghan refugees.
Right, and that is a good point, sir. One hopes that at least the current or incumbent Afghan NSA doesn't contribute to the misery of these refugees who have faced a lot of difficult times by casting aspersions on their persons or their intentions. That was very unfortunate. I am told that we have to conclude the program. I wanted to have a concluding remarks, but I was just ordered that we have to actually end it here. Let me thank Syed Muhammad Ali Saab. Thank you very much, sir, for being part of the program. Asif Durrani Saab, thank you very much, sir. Always great having you in the show. AVM Saab, same goes for you. Great to have you in the studio. Let us hope that in coming days we physically actually have these discussions more, because last time you were on Skype, right? Thank you very much, sir. Viewers, at this moment you have to listen to our participants. Nobody is very hopeful about the situation in Afghanistan, but there seem to be some consensus points that we have to actually look at. One, what happens in Afghanistan in coming days, especially the implication for Pakistan, whether there is going to be an influx of Afghan refugees, and what are we doing to actually take care of it. The second thing, of course, is preparing for what happens in Afghanistan, especially if there is a stalemate. Right now, the narrative is that Taliban are going to take over. You never know. Last time also, Taliban kept on pushing, and yet they couldn't conquer the Panjshir area. Even right now, it can happen. The dynamics can change. So, in that situation, if there is a humanitarian crisis, and if you have hardened your border, how do you help Afghanistan? Or how do you actually ensure that nothing bad happens inside the country? Let us hope tomorrow, when the parliamentarians are briefed, we have some idea of what is going to happen and how Pakistan is going to respond to it all. This was today's program. Thank you very much for watching. Take care.